Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries, and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. The Exiled King. Seretse Khama's Fight for Justice. Introduction. In the vast plains of southern Africa, a young royal would challenge the forces of colonialism, racial prejudice, and political exile to reshape the destiny of his people. Sir Seretse Khama, heir to the Bangwato chieftaincy in Bechuanaland, modern-day Botswana, was destined to lead his people, but his path to leadership was far from conventional. His love story, his exile, and his political struggle would turn him into a global symbol of justice and resilience. While studying law in London, Seretse met and fell in love with Ruth Williams, a British woman. Their interracial marriage in 1948 ignited a political firestorm, enraging both the British government and apartheid-era South Africa, which saw their union as a direct challenge to its policies of racial segregation. Under immense pressure, the British authorities exiled Seretse from his own homeland, stripping him of his chieftaincy and separating him from his people. But exile did not break him, it strengthened his resolve. Over the years, Seretse fought tirelessly for his rightful place, proving himself not just as a leader of the Bangwato people, but as the architect of Botswana's independence. When he finally returned, he led the country into a new era, transforming it from one of the world's poorest nations into an African success story built on democracy, good governance, and economic growth. This documentary traces Seretse Khama's extraordinary journey, from royal heir to exiled leader, from political outcast to the first president of Botswana. Through trials, resilience, and vision, he carved a legacy that still shapes Botswana today. Part 1. A Prince's Destiny. The Early Life of Seretse Khama. The land of the Bangwato stirred with anticipation. A prince had been born, one whose destiny would test the limits of tradition, empire, and justice. On July 1st, 1921, Seretse Khama entered the world in Seretse, Bechuanaland, a British protector caught between its ancient heritage and the encroaching forces of colonial rule. His birth was not just a royal event. It was a moment that carried the weight of history. But fate was swift in testing the young heir. His father, Sekoma II, ruled only briefly before his untimely death in 1925, leaving the Bangwato throne without its rightful leader. At just 4 years old, Seretse was too young to govern, and his future hung in uncertainty. Would he one day reclaim his place, or would British colonial officials find a way to reshape the kingdom to their liking? Into this fragile moment stepped his uncle, Seretse Khama, a brilliant strategist, a fierce guardian of tradition, and a man who would raise Seretse to be a leader. Under Tseretse's rule, Seretse's childhood was defined by discipline, duty, and a relentless expectation of greatness. His uncle, recognizing the growing power of British authorities over Bechuanaland, saw education as the strongest weapon against foreign control. Seretse was sent to Tiger Kloof, a prestigious school for African elites, where he quickly distinguished himself. His mind was sharp, his presence commanding, and his awareness of colonial oppression deepened with every passing year. Even as he studied history and governance, he knew that his own life would one day be written into those very pages. But growing up as a prince was no privilege without burden. Tsekedi ruled as regent, but the people of Bechuanaland never forgot that Seretse was their true heir. Would he be the leader they needed? Would he have the strength to defend them against not only external forces, but the politics within his own kingdom? These questions followed him, pushing him to seek knowledge beyond the borders of his homeland. By 1945, Seretse had set his sights on law, a field that would give him the tools to defend his people's sovereignty. He enrolled at Fort Hare University in South Africa, where he was exposed to the rising tide of African nationalism. Across the continent, voices were rising against colonial rule, demanding self-determination. It was here that he first encountered the radical idea that one day Bechuanaland, too, could forge its own path, free from British oversight. But the true test of his convictions lay ahead. With his uncle's support, Seretse traveled to Britain to study law at Balliol College, Oxford, before transferring to Inner Temple in London. He arrived as a young prince carrying the burden of a kingdom's future, but what awaited him was something no one had foreseen. In the heart of London, amid the corridors of academia and the social circles of post-war Britain, he would meet a woman who would change everything. It would be a love that defied tradition, challenged an empire, and set him on a collision course with forces far greater than he had ever imagined. Part 2, London and Love, meeting Ruth Williams. Seretse Khama arrived in London as a young man with a heavy burden. Though heir to the Bangwato throne, he was just another colonial subject in Britain's rigid social hierarchy. Post-war London was a city of contradictions, rebuilding from destruction while clinging to its imperial past. For Seretse, it was both a place of opportunity and alienation. Here, he could refine his knowledge of law, but he could never escape the shadow of racial prejudice that defined British attitudes toward African leaders. Yet, in this city of rigid traditions, he would find something unexpected: love. It was in 1947, at a London Missionary Society dance, that fate intervened. Seretse was introduced to Ruth Williams, a young British woman with an independent spirit and an open mind. She worked as a clerk at Lloyd's of London and, like Seretse, had a deep love for jazz, a music form that spoke of struggle, resilience, and freedom. Their first conversation was effortless, a meeting of minds and souls. In Ruth, Seretse saw a woman unshaped by the racial and political prejudices that governed his world. In Seretse, Ruth saw a man of intelligence, depth, and quiet strength. Neither of them knew that their encounter would set off a firestorm across 2 continents. Their relationship developed in defiance of the expectations placed upon them. In post-war Britain, interracial relationships were rare and met with suspicion. Friends warned Ruth that a future with Seretse would be difficult, while some of Seretse's peers cautioned him that a relationship with a white woman could complicate his position as a future leader. But the warnings did not matter. As their bond deepened, they saw in each other something worth fighting for. Their love was not just personal, it was political, whether they intended it to be or not. By 1948, Seretse made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He asked Ruth to marry him. There was no hesitation in her answer: yes. Yet, even as they embraced the future together, the forces against them were already gathering. What should have been a simple union between 2 people became a matter of state, a problem that stretched from the halls of British power to the plains of Bechuanaland. When the news of their engagement reached Bechuanaland, it ignited a crisis. Seretse Khama, Seretse's uncle and the regent of the Bangwato, was outraged. To him, this marriage was more than a personal choice. It was a reckless act that could destabilize the entire kingdom. He feared that the people would reject a foreign queen and that British authorities would use the scandal to undermine Seretse's leadership. He demanded that Seretse return home immediately to explain himself. In Britain, the response was no less severe. The colonial authorities, already wary of Seretse's independence, saw the marriage as a dangerous provocation. South Africa, Bechuanaland's powerful southern neighbor, was enforcing strict apartheid policies and viewed the marriage of a black African leader to a white British woman as a direct challenge to their racial laws. Pretoria pressured London to stop the union, warning that allowing it to proceed could threaten diplomatic relations between Britain and South Africa. But Seretse and Ruth refused to bend. They believed that their love was their own to define, not something to be dictated by colonial rule or racial politics. Their wedding went ahead in September 1948, a simple but resolute act of defiance. As they exchanged vows, they knew that the real battle was only beginning. They would soon face rejection from Seretse's own people, hostility from the British government, and exile from the land he was born to rule. Their fight was no longer just for their marriage. It was for the right to love freely, to choose one's own destiny, and to stand against an empire that sought to control their lives. The struggle that awaited them would test their strength, their resilience, and their belief in each other. Would love be enough to withstand the forces determined to tear them apart? The answer would come in the years of exile, betrayal, and resistance that lay ahead. Part 3. A Marriage Under Fire. The Political Fallout. The vows had been exchanged, but Seretse and Ruth Khama's battle was only beginning. Their marriage, a symbol of love and defiance, sent shockwaves from London to Bechuanaland and beyond. What should have been a personal choice became an international controversy, forcing them into the center of a political storm that would determine not just their future, but the fate of an entire nation. The strongest opposition came from Bechuanaland itself. Seretse Khama, Seretse's uncle and regent of the Bangwato, viewed the union as a betrayal of tradition and a dangerous gamble with their people's stability. He believed that a white queen, unfamiliar with their customs, would divide the kingdom and weaken their authority in the eyes of the British colonial administration. When Seretse refused to renounce his marriage, Seretse took drastic action, rallying support among tribal elders to reject his claim to the chieftaincy. Seretse was no longer just fighting colonial rule. He was battling for acceptance among his own people. The British government seized upon this internal conflict, using it as justification to intervene. At a time when Britain was struggling to maintain control over its African territories, the last thing it wanted was a leader who could inspire defiance against colonial rule. But there was another, more pressing reason behind their hostility. South Africa, Bechuanaland's powerful southern neighbor, was enforcing its apartheid policies with ruthless efficiency, and a black African leader married to a white woman was seen as a direct challenge to their racial hierarchy. South African officials made their position clear. If Britain allowed Seretse Khama to rule, Pretoria would retaliate. Britain, dependent on South Africa's gold, uranium, and political cooperation, found itself in a dilemma. The response was swift and brutal. The British government summoned Seretse to London under the pretense of discussing the situation. Expecting negotiations, he arrived in good faith, only to be handed a shocking verdict. He was to be exiled from his own country indefinitely. The official reason was that his marriage had created tribal unrest in Bechuanaland, but the reality was far more insidious. This was not about tribal concerns. It was about appeasing apartheid South Africa and ensuring British economic interests remained intact. Back in Bechuanaland, Ruth was left alone to face the fallout. The British authorities encouraged resistance against her, spreading fears that she would disrupt traditional customs and alienate the people. Some villagers, influenced by Seretse's warnings, kept their distance, unsure of how to respond to a queen who did not look like them. Yet Ruth refused to leave. She had married Seretse not just for love, but for the life they had vowed to build together. She stood firm in the face of isolation, proving that her commitment to Seretse and to Bechuanaland was unshakable. Seretse, meanwhile, fought tirelessly from London. He exposed the political motivations behind his exile, challenging the British government's actions as a betrayal of justice. With every legal and diplomatic avenue blocked, his only weapon was truth. Truth that Britain had exiled a rightful leader to serve its colonial interests. Truth that his people had been denied the right to choose their own ruler. The fight for his return had begun, but Britain was determined to silence him. As the weight of exile bore down on them, Seretse and Ruth stood at a crossroads. Would they surrender to the overwhelming forces against them? Or would they defy an empire determined to erase their union? Their battle had escalated from a marriage in defiance to a full-fledged war against colonial oppression. And in that war, neither of them intended to back down. Part 4. Betrayed by Empire. The British government's intervention. Seretse Khama had once believed in Britain's promises. Promises of fairness, justice, and the rule of law. But his exile had shattered that illusion. The British government, sworn to uphold its colonial responsibilities in Bechuanaland, had instead bowed to apartheid South Africa, sacrificing him to preserve its political and economic interests. Now, Seretse was not just a banished leader. He was a man betrayed by the very empire that had educated him in its legal principles. Back in London, he mounted a relentless campaign to expose the truth behind his exile. He appealed to journalists, politicians, and activists, arguing that Britain's actions were not about tribal unrest, as they claimed, but about maintaining their grip on Africa in the face of growing nationalist movements. His words struck a chord, and soon the British public, many of whom had just fought a war against tyranny, began questioning their government's treatment of an African leader who had done nothing wrong. Newspapers ran headlines condemning the hypocrisy of an empire that preached democracy while denying it to its colonies. Support for Seretse grew, but so did the British government's determination to keep him out. The Colonial Office, under pressure from South Africa, doubled down on its stance. They commissioned a formal inquiry into whether Seretse was fit to rule, a move designed not to find truth, but to justify his permanent exile. The inquiry's findings were damning, not against Seretse, but against the British government itself. It concluded that he was fully capable of leading his people, and that opposition to his rule was neither widespread nor insurmountable. Yet instead of reinstating him, the British government ignored its own report and declared that Seretse would not be allowed to return for at least 5 years. It was a calculated move, designed to weaken his influence and ensure that time, distance, and political maneuvering would erase his claim. For Seretse, the message was clear. Britain would stop at nothing to strip him of his rightful place. He was expected to disappear into obscurity, to accept exile as the price of defying colonial rule. But he refused. If Britain thought it could wear him down, it had gravely underestimated him. Meanwhile, Ruth was enduring her own battle back in Bechuanaland. As a white woman alone in a foreign land, she was meant to feel abandoned, isolated, and broken. The British authorities did everything in their power to pressure her into leaving, but she stood firm. The Bangwato people, despite initial divisions, began to see her strength, her refusal to abandon Seretse's cause, and her willingness to fight alongside them. Slowly, she won their respect, proving that she was not just Seretse's wife. She was his partner in the struggle. As international pressure mounted, the British government found itself increasingly cornered. Opposition politicians in Britain demanded answers. African nationalist movements across the continent used Seretse's case as a rallying cry. And journalists continued to expose the truth. What had started as a quiet betrayal was now a full-blown political scandal. Yet, despite the growing outcry, the British government did not relent. Instead of acknowledging their mistake, they escalated their efforts to erase Seretse's claim entirely. In 1952, they issued their harshest decree yet. Seretse was forced to renounce his chieftaincy in exchange for permission to return home. It was a cruel ultimatum. Accept a life without power in his homeland or remain in exile indefinitely. For Seretse, the decision was agonizing. The chieftaincy was his birthright, his link to his ancestors, and his duty to his people. But he also knew that his fight was no longer just about the throne. It was about something much bigger. Accepting the terms meant sacrificing his royal title, but it also meant reclaiming his presence in Bechuanaland and opening a new chapter in his struggle. With immense sorrow, he agreed. The empire had succeeded in stripping him of his traditional authority, but they had underestimated the depth of his resolve. Seretse may have lost his title, but he had not lost his purpose. In surrendering the chieftaincy, he had freed himself from Britain's control over his future. His battle was no longer about ruling a kingdom. It was about liberating a nation. And with that realization, a new war began, one that would reshape the destiny of Bechuanaland forever. Part 5, Exiled from Home. Seretse's years in political wilderness. Seretse Khama had lost his throne, but not his will to fight. Stripped of his chieftaincy and betrayed by the British government, he was finally allowed to return home in 1956, but not as a chief, not as a leader, but as an ordinary man under the watchful eye of the colonial authorities. His return was meant to signal his defeat, a quiet end to a once powerful figure who had dared to defy empire and apartheid. Yet in reality, it was only the beginning of a new and even greater battle. Bechuanaland was a land in limbo, a British protectorate that lacked the economic strength of its neighbors and remained largely ignored by the empire, except when it suited their strategic interests. The colonial administration expected Seretse to fade into the background, a relic of a past struggle, while they continued to govern the territory as they saw fit. But what they failed to realize was that exile had not broken him. It had refined him. His years away had transformed him from a deposed chief into a man with a far greater vision, one that extended beyond the traditional rule of the Bangwato people. During his years in London, Seretse had studied not only law, but also the shifting tides of African nationalism. Across the continent, liberation movements were gaining momentum, and colonial rule was beginning to unravel. Ghana had declared independence in 1957, and other territories were on the same path. Seretse recognized that his personal struggle had become part of a much larger movement, the fight for Bechuanaland's future as a self-governing nation. His exile had, in a way, given him a new purpose. If he could not rule as a chief, he would lead as a statesman. But the road ahead was anything but easy. His political enemies had not vanished, and many in Bechuanaland still viewed him with suspicion. Seretse Khama, once his greatest rival, had reluctantly come to accept Seretse's presence, but was still wary of his influence. The British authorities, though allowing his return, kept him under constant scrutiny, hoping he would make a misstep that would justify removing him permanently. And apartheid South Africa continued to watch with unease, determined to prevent any form of black-led governance that might inspire resistance within their own borders. Despite these obstacles, Seretse began laying the groundwork for his political resurgence. He traveled across Bechuanaland, reconnecting with the people, listening to their grievances, and building support beyond the Bangwato stronghold. His message was no longer about reclaiming his lost throne. It was about forging a new path forward, one that would free Bechuanaland from British rule and transform it into an independent nation. He spoke of democracy, of self-sufficiency, of breaking free from colonial dependency, and his words resonated with those who had long been neglected by the empire. Meanwhile, Ruth Khama, who had endured years of isolation and scrutiny, became a powerful symbol of resilience in her own right. No longer seen as an outsider, she had earned the respect of many Bechuanaland citizens through her unwavering commitment to Seretse's cause and her ability to stand firm against political and racial hostility. Together, they became a formidable force, proving that their love was not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that propelled them forward. As the winds of change swept through Africa, the British government could no longer ignore the shifting political landscape. Their old strategy of suppression was proving unsustainable, and the rising tide of nationalism across the continent forced them to reconsider their stance on Bechuanaland. Seretse, once cast out as a threat, was becoming an unavoidable figure in the territory's future. Yet the road to self-rule remained uncertain. Britain still held all the power, and South Africa's influence loomed heavily over Bechuanaland's fate. Seretse had returned home, but he was still a leader without a nation, a man caught between colonial rule and the dream of independence. But if exile had taught him anything, it was patience. His time would come, and when it did, he would be ready. Part 6. A Leader in Waiting. The Struggle for Recognition. Seretse Khama had returned home, but his battle was far from over. No longer a chief, not yet a national leader, he existed in a political limbo, a man whose influence was undeniable, yet whose power remained out of reach. The British government had hoped that exile had diminished him, that he would quietly accept a lesser role in Bechuanaland's future. Instead, they found a man more determined than ever, one who now saw beyond the chieftaincy toward an even greater ambition, self-rule for his homeland. But before he could lead Bechuanaland toward independence, he first had to prove himself as a statesman. The colonial authorities still regarded him as a political threat, keeping him under surveillance and restricting his movements. Many tribal leaders remained skeptical, uncertain whether he could be trusted after years away. Even among the Bangwato, lingering divisions persisted. Some still questioned whether he had sacrificed too much by renouncing his chieftaincy. Yet, despite these challenges, Seretse methodically rebuilt his political standing, determined to forge a path that would place the destiny of Bechuanaland into the hands of its own people. He immersed himself in grassroots politics, traveling across the protectorate to speak with farmers, traders, and village elders. He listened to their struggles, poverty, lack of infrastructure, and the ever-present dominance of British rule, and assured them that a new future was possible. His message was clear: Bechuanaland needed more than a chief. It needed a government of its own. This vision resonated deeply with those who had long felt neglected under colonial administration. For the first time, many began to see him not just as a deposed tribal leader, but as the man who could unify the territory's many voices into a single movement. But Seretse was not the only one with ambitions. Other African nationalist movements were rising across the continent, with leaders in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya paving the way for self-determination. British officials, realizing that full colonial control was becoming unsustainable, began making slow concessions to local governance, but always on their own terms. In Bechuanaland, they proposed modest reforms, offering the formation of advisory councils rather than real political representation. It was a deliberate strategy designed to give the illusion of progress while ensuring ultimate control remained with the British. Seretse saw through these tactics and refused to settle for half measures. If Bechuanaland was to determine its own future, it needed a real political structure, one that could challenge British authority and demand true self-governance. With this goal in mind, he began organizing what would become his greatest political weapon, a national movement that would unite the people beyond tribal affiliations. This was a crucial turning point. In 1961, he co-founded the Bechuanaland Democratic Party, BP, a political force built on the principles of democracy, economic development, and independence. Unlike traditional tribal politics, which had long defined leadership in the region, the BP appealed to all Bechuanaland citizens, regardless of ethnic background. Seretse had learned from the struggles of other African nationalist leaders and knew that colonial powers thrived on division. So he worked tirelessly to build a coalition that could not be easily fractured. Yet, even as his movement gained traction, the challenges remained immense. The British government viewed his party with suspicion, fearing it would destabilize their hold over the protectorate. South Africa, alarmed by the rise of Black-led political movements, pressured Britain to suppress any steps towards self-rule in Bechuanaland. And within the territory itself, some conservative tribal leaders resisted change, fearing that a new political system would weaken their influence. Seretse faced these obstacles with characteristic patience and strategy. Instead of direct confrontation, he focused on proving that his vision was not one of chaos, but of stability and progress. He emphasized Bechuanaland's potential, not as a weak, dependent territory, but as a nation capable of governing itself with wisdom and economic foresight. His approach gained him allies beyond Africa, drawing the support of international figures who saw in him a leader of integrity and vision. As momentum built, the colonial administration was forced to acknowledge that Seretse Khama was no longer just a former chief demanding personal restitution. He was now the political voice of a people demanding their independence. But Britain was not ready to relinquish control so easily. They would test him, challenge him, and attempt to manipulate the political landscape to their advantage. The next phase of Seretse's struggle would not be fought in exile or through tribal disputes. It would be fought at the highest levels of negotiation and governance. And he was ready. Part 7. Return to Bechuanaland, reclaiming his place. Seretse Khama had spent years shaping himself into a leader who could not be ignored. His exile had tested his resilience, but it had also sharpened his vision. Now, with a growing political movement behind him and the winds of change sweeping across Africa, he stood on the threshold of reclaiming his place, not as a tribal chief, but as the leader of a nation in waiting. His return to Bechuanaland was met with a mix of celebration and uncertainty. For the Bangwato people, he remained their rightful leader, but his renunciation of the chieftaincy still lingered in their minds. Some welcomed him back with open arms, while others questioned whether he had abandoned tradition in favor of politics. Yet beyond the Bangwato, there was a new reality taking shape. Bechuanaland was no longer simply a collection of tribal groups under British rule. It was becoming a nation, and Seretse had positioned himself at the forefront of this transformation. The colonial government, wary of his growing influence, tried to restrict his political reach. British officials had hoped that exile would weaken his standing, but instead it had turned him into a statesman with international support. Now, back in Bechuanaland, he began laying the groundwork for something far greater than the reinstatement of his chieftaincy. His focus was on governance, development, and ultimately independence. His first challenge was to unify a fragmented political landscape. While Bechuanaland had no history of formal political parties, colonial rule had created divisions. Some leaders aligned with the British administration, while others resisted change altogether. Seretse, however, understood that unity was the key to securing self-rule. He intensified efforts to build the Bechuanaland Democratic Party, BP, ensuring it was not just a movement of resistance, but a viable political entity with a clear vision for the country's future. With a tireless energy, he traveled across the protectorate, holding meetings in villages, towns, and rural settlements. He spoke of economic development, infrastructure, and the need for a government that served its people rather than the colonial administration. His ability to connect with ordinary citizens, farmers, traders, and workers set him apart from other political figures. He was not just advocating for independence. He was offering a roadmap for a better future. But his rise was not without opposition. The British administration saw him as a disruptive force and sought ways to curb his influence. They attempted to create rival political groups, hoping to fragment support for his party. At the same time, conservative tribal elders, who feared the erosion of their traditional authority, resisted the idea of a national government. Even South Africa, deeply invested in maintaining a buffer of British-controlled territories, watched his movements with concern. Seretse, however, remained unwavering. He understood that Bechuanaland's path to self-rule could not rely on defiance alone. It had to be built through diplomatic strategy and practical governance. He emphasized stability over revolution, ensuring that his movement was not perceived as radical, but as a responsible and prepared force for leadership. His message was clear: Bechuanaland could not afford chaos. It needed structured and deliberate progress. As support for the BP surged, the British government could no longer dismiss his influence. In 1965, as part of a larger wave of decolonization, Britain conceded to holding democratic elections in Bechuanaland. It was the moment Seretse had been preparing for. The people would finally have a say in their future, and Seretse Khama was ready to lead them. But the fight was not yet over. The transition to self-rule would be fraught with challenges: negotiations with Britain, the looming economic uncertainty of an independent Bechuanaland, and the need to establish governance structures from the ground up. Yet for the first time, the prospect of independence was no longer a distant dream. It was within reach. Seretse had reclaimed his place, not as a chief, but as the political leader who would shape Bechuanaland's destiny. The next battle would be the most defining of all: the push for full independence. Part 8, The Winds of Change, the Push for Independence. The tide of history was shifting across Africa. Colonized nations were breaking free, reclaiming their identities and forging their own destinies. The echoes of independence movements in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya resonated through Bechuanaland, where Seretse Khama stood at the forefront of a growing demand for self-rule. Decades of British control had left the protectorate underdeveloped, its people voiceless in decisions that shaped their future. But now, with momentum on his side, Seretse was ready to lead Bechuanaland toward a long-awaited independence. The British government, though increasingly open to decolonization, still hesitated when it came to Bechuanaland. Unlike wealthier colonies, the protectorate lacked infrastructure, industries, and a robust economy. Many British officials doubted whether it could sustain itself as an independent nation. Some even suggested merging it with South Africa, a prospect that horrified Seretse and his supporters, given South Africa's brutal apartheid policies. To counter this, he knew he had to prove that Bechuanaland was not only politically ready, but also capable of standing on its own economically. Seretse intensified his campaign, traveling tirelessly across the protectorate. He met with community leaders, farmers, and traders, explaining why independence was not just an ideal, but a necessity. His message was clear. Continued colonial rule would leave Bechuanaland stagnant, while self-governance would allow its people to determine their own destiny. His ability to connect with both traditional elders and modern political thinkers made him the unifying force that Bechuanaland desperately needed. The British, sensing the inevitability of change, agreed to formal discussions. In 1963, negotiations for a new political structure began, leading to the establishment of a legislative council. This was a crucial step. Though still under British oversight, it allowed Bechuanaland to begin governing itself. But Seretse knew this was not enough. He pushed relentlessly for full independence, ensuring that Bechuanaland's voice could no longer be ignored. At the same time, regional tensions shaped the urgency of the movement. South Africa, led by its apartheid government, sought to maintain influence over neighboring territories. The white minority regime in southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe, was equally resistant to black-led governance. For Bechuanaland, independence was not just about breaking from Britain. It was about resisting the pressures of oppressive regimes that surrounded it. Seretse understood that Botswana's survival would depend on its ability to remain neutral yet firm in its sovereignty. By 1965, the breakthrough came. Britain conceded to holding the first democratic elections in Bechuanaland. Seretse's Bechuanaland Democratic Party, BP, emerged as the dominant force, winning a decisive victory. The message from the people was undeniable. Bechuanaland was ready to govern itself. With this mandate, the final push for independence gained unstoppable momentum. In 1966, negotiations with Britain reached their climax. Seretse Khama, alongside his delegation, secured a deal that would grant Bechuanaland full sovereignty. It was a moment of triumph, but also of enormous responsibility. The world was watching. Could this small, landlocked nation, with few natural resources and little infrastructure, succeed on its own? Seretse believed it could. On September 30th, 1966, Bechuanaland officially became the Republic of Botswana. The Union Jack was lowered, and in its place, Botswana's new flag was raised, a symbol of a nation stepping into its own future. At its helm stood Seretse Khama, the first president of Botswana, a man who had fought exile, colonial resistance, and political doubt to bring his people to this defining moment. But independence was just the beginning. The real test lay ahead: building a stable government, transforming Botswana's struggling economy, and ensuring that the dreams of self-rule translated into real progress for its people. Seretse had won the battle for independence. Now, he had to win the battle for Botswana's future. Part 9. The Birth of Botswana, Founding a Nation. As dawn broke on September 30th, 1966, a new era began. The land once known as Bechuanaland was now the Republic of Botswana. After decades of colonial rule, political struggle, and relentless perseverance, Seretse Khama stood before his people, not as an exiled chief, not as a political outcast, but as the first president of an independent nation. The celebrations were grand, but the weight of responsibility loomed even larger. Botswana had won its freedom, but now it had to prove it could stand on its own. Few nations faced a more daunting start. Botswana was one of the poorest countries in the world, with no paved roads, minimal infrastructure, and a fragile economy heavily dependent on cattle farming. The British had long dismissed it as unviable, an afterthought of empire with little potential for development. To the south, apartheid-era South Africa cast a long shadow, while to the north, the white minority regimes of Rhodesia and Southwest Africa, now Namibia, threatened regional stability. The challenges were immense, but Seretse Khama was not a leader to cower before adversity. His first priority was governance. Unlike many post-colonial African leaders who consolidated power through authoritarian rule, Seretse set a different course. He established a multi-party democracy, an independent judiciary, and a transparent government system. He wanted Botswana to be a nation where leadership was accountable and the rule of law prevailed. The capital was moved from Mafeking in South Africa to Gaborone, a symbolic and practical move to assert Botswana's sovereignty. A new constitution was drafted, setting the foundation for democratic governance, civil liberties, and free elections. Stability, he knew, was key to attracting investment and ensuring long-term prosperity, but governance alone was not enough. Botswana needed economic transformation. With a landlocked geography and no significant industry, Seretse faced the urgent question: how could Botswana develop when it had so few resources? Many feared it would remain a subsistence economy, heavily reliant on foreign aid. Seretse refused to accept this fate. He pursued a vision of self-sufficiency, seeking partners who would invest in Botswana's untapped potential rather than exploit its vulnerabilities. A turning point came in 1967, just a year after independence. Vast diamond deposits were discovered in Orapa, transforming Botswana's economic outlook overnight. But Seretse was determined that Botswana would not fall into the trap of other African nations, where wealth was monopolized by a corrupt elite while the people remained impoverished. Instead of allowing foreign corporations to control the diamond industry, he negotiated a unique partnership with De Beers, ensuring that Botswana retained a major share of profits. These revenues would be reinvested into education, healthcare, and infrastructure, laying the groundwork for long-term national development. Despite these strides, Botswana was not immune to external pressures. South Africa, deeply entrenched in apartheid, viewed Botswana's democratic model with suspicion. The white minority regimes of Rhodesia and Namibia saw it as a threat to their control. Seretse navigated these tensions carefully, choosing a path of non-alignment, maintaining diplomatic relations while making it clear that Botswana would not be a puppet of any foreign power. He refused to allow apartheid influence within his borders, yet he also ensured that Botswana did not provoke hostilities that could threaten its fragile new government. As the first years of independence unfolded, Botswana began to defy expectations. Roads were built, schools were expanded, healthcare improved, and a generation of leaders emerged, educated under Seretse's policies. The Botswana pula was introduced as the national currency, further cementing economic independence. From the ashes of colonial neglect, a nation was rising, guided by a leader who understood that true freedom meant more than political independence. It meant prosperity, dignity, and self-determination for his people. Yet the work was far from finished. Botswana had taken its first steps as a nation, but its future remained uncertain. Could it sustain its early progress? Could it withstand the pressures of a turbulent region? And most importantly, could Seretse's vision of democracy and development endure beyond his leadership? The next phase of his journey would test these questions as he transitioned from a leader of independence to a presence shaping the destiny of a nation. Part 10. From Chief to President, Leading the New Republic. After the birth of Botswana, the road ahead was far from easy. Seretse Khama, once a prince, now faced the monumental task of transforming his newly independent country into a thriving republic. The expectations were high, not just within Botswana, but on the international stage as well. A former protectorate with limited resources, Botswana had to prove that it could sustain its freedom, build a stable government, and cultivate economic prosperity despite its challenges. Seretse's transition from a traditional chief to a modern president was a complex one. As a traditional leader of the Bangwato people, he had deep roots in the tribal customs and systems of governance that had shaped his upbringing. Yet, as president of an independent nation, he understood that modern governance required new models of leadership and a commitment to democratic principles. The delicate balance between tradition and modernity would define much of his presidency. The structure of Botswana's government reflected Seretse's pragmatic approach. While the nation embraced a democratic constitution, Seretse understood the importance of maintaining tribal cohesion while building a national identity. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the traditional leadership structures did not conflict with the authority of the new democratic government. Through strategic dialogue and careful consideration, he ensured that the tribal chiefs played a role in governance without undermining the progress toward a more centralized national state. This allowed him to bridge the gap between Botswana's deeply rooted customs and its modern democratic aspirations. His first few years as president were marked by relentless nation-building efforts. Seretse believed that the future of Botswana hinged on education. A well-educated populace was crucial for the nation's progress. He prioritized creating a universal education system, offering primary, secondary, and eventually higher education to as many citizens as possible. At the time of independence, only a fraction of the population was literate, but by the 1970s, Botswana had seen dramatic improvements in educational standards. This focus on education created a skilled workforce, essential for both public service and private sector growth. Simultaneously, Seretse recognized the importance of a robust healthcare system. Although Botswana had limited resources, he focused on combating the major health issues affecting his people, such as malaria and tuberculosis. His administration worked to improve access to basic healthcare services and introduced initiatives to combat HIV/AIDS when it became a significant threat in the following decades. In the face of these domestic challenges, Seretse's leadership on the international stage was equally crucial. Surrounded by countries facing apartheid or under colonial rule, Botswana was seen as a beacon of hope for those striving for self-determination and democracy. He championed the causes of African unity, often speaking out against the injustices of apartheid and colonialism, and called for stronger ties between African nations. Under Seretse's leadership, Botswana positioned itself as a neutral yet steadfast voice in the southern African region, maintaining peaceful relations with neighboring countries while advocating for human rights and equality. International recognition came in the form of increasing foreign aid and investment, particularly as Botswana's diamond industry continued to grow in significance. The steady income from diamond mining, coupled with the wise economic policies Seretse enacted, enabled Botswana to build a more diversified economy. It wasn't just about extracting wealth, it was about creating a foundation for sustainable development that would benefit future generations. As president, Seretse was always mindful of the fragility of his nation, the potential for regional conflicts, the challenge of maintaining political stability, and the risks of corruption and mismanagement in a growing economy. He ensured that Botswana remained a stable democracy, with regular elections, a free press, and a strong legal system. His policies created an environment where democracy could flourish, and despite regional instability, Botswana remained a symbol of democratic success in Africa. The role of the president, while ceremonial in some ways, was central to the spirit of Botswana's national unity. Seretse's leadership style, characterized by humility, integrity, and dedication, set the tone for his successors, embedding principles of good governance deep within Botswana's political culture. Under his guidance, Botswana moved confidently into the world as a beacon of hope for African independence and democratic values. But as the years passed, Seretse knew that his presidency couldn't last forever. He had to ensure that the foundation for Botswana's continued success was solidified for future generations. His legacy, one of nation-building, democratic governance, and economic growth, would be the bedrock upon which Botswana stood for years to come. Part 11. Diamonds and Development. Transforming Botswana's Economy. The discovery of diamonds in Orapa in 1967 marked a turning point for Botswana, offering an opportunity for economic transformation few nations ever encounter. The landlocked country, once dismissed as economically insignificant, now held one of the world's most valuable natural resources under its soil. But this windfall was no guarantee of prosperity. Across Africa, resource-rich nations had too often fallen victim to the resource curse, where the wealth of natural resources led to corruption, conflict, and mismanagement. Seretse Khama, however, had a vision for Botswana that went beyond short-term gain. He would ensure that the nation's newfound wealth would be used to build a stable and sustainable future, laying the foundation for economic development that would endure for generations. From the outset, Seretse was determined that Botswana's diamond wealth would not fall into the hands of foreign corporations that would exploit the country's resources with little benefit to its people. Instead, he pursued a unique and shrewd partnership with De Beers, the global diamond giant, ensuring that the majority of profits from diamond mining would stay within the country. Through this agreement, Botswana retained a significant share in the diamond mining operations and ensured that the revenue would be directed toward nation-building efforts. By 1975, the formation of Debswana, a joint venture between the Botswana government and De Beers, marked the beginning of a long-term relationship that would prove essential to the nation's economic development. The influx of revenue from diamonds allowed Seretse to invest in vital areas such as infrastructure, healthcare, education, and public services. But it was his focus on long-term planning that distinguished Botswana from other resource-dependent nations. Rather than allowing the government to become complacent, Seretse insisted on diversifying the economy, fostering agriculture, tourism, and manufacturing industries alongside diamonds. Under Seretse's leadership, Botswana introduced policies that promoted sustainable economic growth and good governance. He implemented measures to reduce corruption, ensuring that the diamond revenue was managed transparently and used for the betterment of the nation's people. One of the first priorities was the construction of infrastructure, building roads, schools, and hospitals that would improve the quality of life for the citizens of Botswana. These investments laid the groundwork for a more connected and accessible country, increasing opportunities for both urban and rural communities. Furthermore, Seretse's administration established a stable currency, the pula, which further bolstered Botswana's economic security. With its stable currency, Botswana attracted foreign investment and developed a strong trade relationship with countries such as the United States, Japan, and South Africa. Seretse also focused on developing human capital, creating a well-educated and skilled workforce capable of taking on key roles in the growing economy. He emphasized education, ensuring that Botswana's youth received the skills necessary for both private sector and government employment. Internationally, Botswana's success became a model for others. Seretse's wise management of diamond resources set an example for how countries could use their natural wealth to fuel development rather than destruction. Botswana's economic policies became a case study for sustainable growth, with the country consistently ranking as one of the most economically stable and well-managed in Africa. Seretse's pragmatic and visionary approach to governance, paired with his relentless pursuit of economic justice for his people, established him as a leader whose influence extended far beyond the borders of his nation. By the 1980s, Botswana was considered one of Africa's most successful economies, with low corruption levels, an open market, and a growing middle class. With diamond mining as the cornerstone, the country diversified into other sectors such as beef exports, manufacturing, and tourism, gradually reducing its dependence on a single resource. The success of Botswana's economy was a direct result of Seretse's ability to leverage natural resources for the public good, ensuring that wealth did not remain in the hands of a few, but benefited the entire nation. As Botswana's economy continued to grow, the country became a beacon of stability and prosperity in a region often marked by political instability and economic uncertainty. Seretse Khama's legacy was one of sound governance, long-term planning, and a commitment to economic justice for all his people. In a continent where the benefits of natural wealth had often been squandered or mismanaged, Botswana's success under Seretse set a remarkable example of what was possible when leaders prioritized the well-being of their people over personal gain. But even as Botswana flourished, Seretse remained mindful of the challenges ahead. Could the country maintain its economic stability as the diamond industry evolved? Could the wealth continue to be distributed fairly as the nation grew? And as the 1990s loomed, could Botswana continue to thrive as the challenges of modernization and globalization emerged? These questions would frame the next phase of Seretse's legacy, a legacy not only built on economic prosperity, but also on sustainable development that would serve Botswana for generations to come. Part 12: Navigating Apartheid, Botswana's Role in Southern Africa. As the world watched, the Southern African region was embroiled in one of the most profound struggles for freedom in the 20th century, To the south, South Africa's apartheid regime brutalized its black population, enforcing racial segregation and systemic oppression with unyielding force. But while apartheid dominated the landscape, Botswana, under the leadership of Seretse Khama, stood as an unwavering symbol of democracy, human rights, and hope for a better future. Seretse's unique position, both geographically and politically, gave him a pivotal role in the resistance to apartheid. Botswana shared a border with South Africa, and many of those fleeing the harsh conditions of apartheid sought refuge in Botswana. However, Botswana's position was a delicate one, surrounded by countries deeply affected by the apartheid regime's influence. While Botswana's government had to maintain neutrality and peace, Seretse was firm in his commitment to support liberation movements that sought to dismantle apartheid and establish equal rights for all South Africans. Throughout his presidency, Seretse maintained an open line of communication with organizations like the African National Congress, ANC, and the Pan-African Congress, PAC, which were leading the charge against apartheid. Botswana offered refuge and logistical support for freedom fighters, including training camps for exiled ANC members and providing a safe haven for activists to regroup and strategize. Although Botswana was not directly involved in military conflict, it became a crucial ally for the anti-apartheid struggle, playing an essential role in coordinating regional resistance efforts. The country's foreign policy reflected Seretse's belief in Pan-African solidarity and the importance of African unity in the fight against colonialism and oppression. Seretse, in alignment with the Organization of African Unity, OAU, took every opportunity to amplify the voices of those fighting apartheid. He understood that Botswana's own independence could only be meaningful if it contributed to the broader struggle for African liberation across the continent. Botswana's diplomatic stance towards South Africa was one of unwavering opposition, even as it maintained peaceful relations with the apartheid state in order to protect its own stability. In addition to his support of anti-apartheid movements, Seretse took a firm stance on sanctions against South Africa, advocating for the international community to impose economic pressure on the apartheid government. While not always popular, Seretse's leadership in this area was essential in keeping the spotlight on the international injustice of apartheid and ensuring that Botswana's position remained clear and unyielding. Botswana's role in apartheid-era Southern Africa was crucial, but it also came with risks. As one of the few countries openly supporting the struggle against apartheid, Botswana was vulnerable to reprisals from the apartheid regime. The relationship between Botswana and South Africa was fraught with tension, particularly as the South African government sought to suppress any form of resistance to its rule. Despite this, Seretse's leadership maintained Botswana's sovereignty and independence, shielding his nation from the direct effects of South Africa's rage toward opposition countries. Seretse was aware of the dangers that surrounded Botswana in such a volatile region. Yet his vision for Botswana was never about playing it safe. He understood the sacrifices that would be necessary to uphold Botswana's principles of justice and democracy, while supporting regional efforts to end apartheid. His efforts earned him the respect of African leaders and the global community, positioning Botswana as a small but critical player in the fight for justice in Southern Africa. Despite Botswana's strong stance, Seretse also understood the need to walk a fine line with his larger neighbors like Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Namibia, all of which were undergoing their own struggles for independence and democratic rule. Botswana's role as a neutral mediator was essential in maintaining peace within the region, often offering a platform for discussions that allowed for greater unity and strategy against the threat of apartheid spread. The international stage saw Seretse's leadership shine not just in political advocacy, but in his steadfast commitment to peaceful solutions, diplomacy, and the larger vision of an inclusive and unified Africa. Botswana's policies of neutrality, humanitarian support, and the strong diplomatic channels Seretse established paved the way for the eventual downfall of apartheid and the peaceful emergence of a new South Africa. By the late 1980s, when South Africa faced increasing global isolation, internal unrest, and pressure from resistance movements within the country, Seretse's influence was undeniable. Botswana had positioned itself as a true symbol of resistance and support for human dignity, standing resolutely in opposition to apartheid's policies of division and discrimination. Seretse's legacy in this context was far-reaching. His leadership in supporting anti-apartheid efforts and his promotion of a peaceful, democratic Africa resonated across the continent and laid the foundation for Southern African unity, which would remain a guiding force in the region's post-apartheid recovery. Part 13. A Legacy of Democracy. Seretse's Political Philosophy. Seretse Khama's political philosophy was anchored in a belief in democracy, transparency, and the power of inclusive governance. His leadership in Botswana exemplified the idea that true democracy was not just about holding elections, but about creating a system where the people's voice was central to the decision-making process. Seretse, having experienced the injustices of colonial rule and racial discrimination firsthand, understood that democracy had to be built from the ground up, with a deep respect for the rights of every citizen. From the moment he assumed the presidency, Seretse worked tirelessly to create a political environment in Botswana that was not only democratic, but also responsive to the needs of the people. His vision was one of a modern, stable, and peaceful state, where institutions were strong, transparent, and accountable. Seretse rejected the authoritarian models that plagued many African nations and chose instead to foster a political system that allowed for plurality of ideas, freedom of speech, and free press. At the heart of Seretse's political philosophy was a commitment to economic and social justice. He believed that the prosperity generated by the country's diamond wealth should benefit all Botswana, not just an elite few. This principle of equity was woven into the very fabric of Botswana's governance, as Seretse focused on reducing poverty, providing universal education, and ensuring that all citizens had access to basic health care. Under his leadership, Botswana became known for its successful development model, where the distribution of resources was prioritized to serve the greater good rather than to fuel inequality. Seretse's philosophy of inclusive governance extended to his approach to tribalism and ethnic divisions, which were often a source of conflict in other African countries. Rather than promoting tribalism, he sought to unify Botswana's people around the common cause of national development and prosperity. In a society with diverse ethnic groups, he worked to create a sense of national unity, one that was rooted in respect for the rights of all tribes, while simultaneously fostering a shared identity as Botswana. This vision of unity helped stabilize the nation, allowing Seretse to lead a multi-ethnic society that cooperated in the pursuit of common goals. In the realm of governance, Seretse implemented checks and balances to ensure that power did not become concentrated in the hands of a single leader or group. Botswana's parliamentary democracy allowed for regular elections, with political parties offering a range of policies and ideas for the public to choose from. This system was in stark contrast to many African countries where one-party states or military coups were the norm. Seretse's commitment to free and fair elections helped to establish a political culture of accountability, where leaders were held responsible for their actions and the public was encouraged to participate in the political process. Seretse's democratic ideals were complemented by his pragmatic approach to political compromise. He understood the importance of cooperation between different political parties, factions, and interest groups, and he encouraged dialogue and collaboration to address the nation's challenges. In his view, democracy was not about winning at all costs, but about ensuring that governance was for the people, not against them. His leadership style was based on consensus building, and he often sought to mediate disputes between opposing political factions in the interest of national unity. On the global stage, Seretse's commitment to democracy extended beyond Botswana's borders. He advocated for a free, just, and peaceful world where nations upheld the principles of human dignity and equality, much like Botswana did at home. This belief in international democracy saw Seretse actively participating in various global forums and aligning Botswana with countries that shared similar values of self-determination, sovereignty, and human rights. His legacy is reflected in Botswana's continued adherence to democratic principles, even as other African nations face political turbulence and military dictatorships. Seretse's legacy also included his focus on political stability, which was achieved through the careful management of diversity, effective political engagement, and inclusive policies. His vision ensured that Botswana became one of Africa's most successful democracies, with peaceful transitions of power and an enduring commitment to democratic norms. The country's strong political institutions and its commitment to rule of law were key to its longevity as a democratic state. As Seretse's health began to decline in the late 1980s, the nation continued to flourish under the framework of democracy he had built. His political philosophy lived on through his successors, who were guided by the principles of freedom, equality, and justice. Even in his absence, Seretse's impact was profound. Botswana's democracy was not just a legacy of governance, but a testament to his belief in the power of people to shape their destiny. By the time of Seretse Khama's passing in 1980, Botswana was firmly established as a beacon of democracy in Africa. His unwavering commitment to democratic principles, human rights, and political stability not only ensured the prosperity of his own people, but also set an example for other nations to follow. Seretse's political philosophy continues to inspire leaders and citizens around the world who believe in the transformative power of democracy. Part 14. The Final Years: Health, Challenges, and Reflections. By the late 1970s, Seretse Khama's leadership was being tested in new ways. Despite the remarkable success he had achieved in transforming Botswana into a stable democracy, the challenges of the world and his personal health began to catch up with him. In the face of a flourishing economy, a peaceful political climate, and international acclaim for his leadership, Seretse was not immune to the natural passage of time or the demands that came with running a young nation. For several years, Seretse had suffered from declining health, and his ability to carry out his presidential duties began to diminish. Diagnosed with cancer, his physical strength gradually waned, and the once vibrant leader found himself confronting a personal struggle that he had not anticipated. However, despite his declining health, Seretse's commitment to his country never wavered. He continued to serve as president and worked tirelessly to maintain Botswana's growth and prosperity, even as his energy faltered. During these final years, Seretse faced challenges that went beyond his health. The global landscape was changing rapidly, with new geopolitical realities emerging, and the region was still recovering from the devastating impacts of colonialism. Seretse's leadership had to navigate the evolving complexities of Southern Africa, where many neighboring nations were grappling with their own struggles for political stability and independence. The weight of these challenges was compounded by the health crisis he was facing, forcing him to increasingly rely on his cabinet and trusted advisors for guidance and support. Even as his health deteriorated, Seretse took comfort in knowing that Botswana had come a long way under his leadership. The foundation of democracy and political stability he had worked so hard to build was firmly in place, and the country's economic growth was becoming a model for other African nations. But as the years passed, Seretse had to come to terms with the reality that his time was running out. His focus shifted toward ensuring a smooth transition of power and preparing Botswana for the future without his presence at the helm. As his health continued to deteriorate, Seretse made a poignant decision. He began preparing for the leadership transition that would carry Botswana's success into the next generation. His successor, his own Vice President Heir, was selected as the next leader, ensuring that the values Seretse had fought for, democracy, equality, and peace, would continue to guide the nation in his absence. Seretse's decision to entrust his country's future to someone he trusted ensured that the political stability of Botswana would not be compromised after his death. Reflecting on his life, Seretse was proud of the legacy he had built, but remained humble about the sacrifices made along the way. He had seen his fair share of challenges, from being exiled from his homeland to facing intense political opposition. But he had always remained true to his ideals and to the people of Botswana. Looking back at his achievements, he often spoke of the importance of unity and self-determination, themes that had shaped his entire life and guided him throughout his presidency. Seretse passed away in July 1980, leaving behind a profound and enduring legacy. His death marked the end of an era for Botswana, but it also served as a powerful reminder of what one man's vision could achieve in the face of adversity. Botswana, now firmly on the path of democracy and prosperity, stood as a testament to Seretse's leadership and his unwavering commitment to justice and equality for all. As Botswana entered the post-Seretse era, his influence remained deeply ingrained in the fabric of the nation. The country's democratic institutions and its commitment to human rights continued to thrive long after his passing, and his memory became a source of inspiration for future leaders. Seretse Khama's story is one of struggle, resilience, and vision, but it is also a reminder of the power of leadership to transform a nation and change the course of history. Part 15: A Nation's Father: The Enduring Legacy of Seretse Khama. Seretse Khama's passing in 1980 marked the end of an era in Botswana's history, but his legacy lived on, deeply embedded in the country's political, social, and economic fabric. His vision for a democratic, stable, and prosperous Botswana did not end with his death. Rather, it continued to guide the country well into the future. Botswana, a land that once faced uncertainty under colonial rule and apartheid, had become a beacon of peace, democracy, and progress on the African continent, thanks in large part to Seretse's leadership. In the years following Seretse's death, Botswana's commitment to democratic principles became even more apparent. Under the leadership of his chosen successor, Betrayal, the country maintained its trajectory of economic growth, political stability, and social development. Seretse's unwavering commitment to democracy ensured that the principles of free elections, transparency, and respect for human rights remained central to Botswana's governance. His legacy endured not only through the policies he implemented, but also through the political culture he had fostered, a culture of accountability, inclusivity, and equality. In the decades that followed, Botswana became known as one of the most successful democracies in Africa. The country's economic development, largely driven by its diamond industry, coupled with its political stability, made it a model for other African nations to follow. Botswana's pragmatic and transparent approach to governance, which Seretse had pioneered, set it apart from other nations in the region, where corruption and political unrest often held sway. Seretse's impact was not limited to the political or economic realm. It extended to education and healthcare as well. Under his leadership, Botswana made substantial strides in expanding access to education and healthcare for its citizens. Seretse's vision of a well-educated and healthy populace was a cornerstone of his political philosophy, and it laid the foundation for the country's long-term success. His focus on education, particularly in rural areas, ensured that Botswana's future generations would have the tools and opportunities to continue building on the legacy he had created. As Botswana entered the 21st century, Seretse Khama's legacy remained a guiding light for the country's leaders and citizens alike. The democratic values he championed, peace, unity, and respect for diversity, continue to resonate in every corner of the nation. The rule of law and good governance remain key pillars of Botswana's political system, and the country's commitment to human rights remained unwavering. Seretse's legacy also extended beyond Botswana's borders. He became a symbol of resilience and justice for African nations struggling with the aftermath of colonialism and oppression. His efforts to challenge the status quo, particularly his resistance to colonial interference and his fight for self-determination, resonated with people across the continent and around the world. Perhaps one of the most lasting elements of Seretse's legacy was his belief in the power of unity. As a leader, he worked tirelessly to bring together the different ethnic groups in Botswana, transcending tribal divisions and creating a unified national identity. His vision of a cohesive, multi-ethnic society has continued to serve as a model for nations around the world grappling with issues of ethnic conflict and division. In Botswana, Seretse is remembered not only as the first president, but also as the father of the nation, whose unwavering commitment to justice, equality, and democracy laid the foundation for a prosperous and peaceful country. His life and legacy are celebrated annually, and his contributions to the world continue to inspire new generations of leaders and citizens committed to building a better, more just world. Seretse Khama's story is one of remarkable achievement against all odds. His legacy is a testament to the power of visionary leadership and the transformative impact one person can have on the course of history. The story of Botswana's success is inextricably linked to his life, and as the country continues to thrive, it does so with the memory of its founding father ever present. The nation he built stands as a living tribute to his vision, and his impact will echo throughout the ages. Thanks for tuning into Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.